Well, I think we have to base our judgments about the future on what's happened in the last 30 years. And despite some discouragement and even pessimism about being able to reduce poverty in the world, there's been tremendous progress. Between 1981 and 2011, all regions of the world were able to fight back extreme poverty, even Africa, which had trouble until recently reducing poverty. In East Asia, which in 1981 was the poorest region in the world, with 81% of the population living on less than $1.25 a day, the proportion of the extreme poor has dropped to just 13%. It's a fantastic progress. Also in South Asia, where 60% of the population were very poor 30 years ago, the number is down to 40%. In Africa, the number has dropped just slightly from 51% to 47%, but it's a good sign, because for 30 years, even before 1981, Africa was getting poorer rather than less poor. So it has been possible in the world, despite different economic conditions and political challenges and political conflict, to make a difference to people who were very, very poor. The less encouraging news is during that same 30-year period, a large proportion of the population of the developing world, about 2.3 billion people, or 40% of the population of the developing world, stayed at the same income level, just above $2 a day. So for them, technological and economic progress has just kept pace with population growth. Now the challenge is, how can one continue the pace of reducing poverty in the world without China, which has made the greatest difference to fighting poverty. China, because of growth in China, the number of extreme poor in the world dropped by half in just 10 years, between 2001 and 2011. Now most of the poor people in the world are concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and India. There's about 400 million very poor people in those two places. And so it'll be much harder to maintain the pace reducing poverty. Add to this the challenge of reduced capacity of the atmosphere to accept or absorb carbon emissions, and that complicates the fight against poverty significantly. I suggested in my talk that there should be a way of reconciling continued fight against poverty in the world and a more responsible attitude to the use of fossil fuels through the use of so-called green or clean energies. But this will require a great deal of money in order to make the investments and develop further technologies for the future. But interestingly enough, the World Bank estimates that it wouldn't be necessary to increase taxes on people to achieve a better balance between growth and respect for the environment. If an effort was made to reduce or eliminate a large number of subsidies that exist in the world to promote energy use, more water use, and other subsidies related to consumption, which are not really necessary. In fact, the International Monetary Fund estimates that if just the energy subsidies were removed, about $480 billion a year, the level of carbon emissions in the world would drop by 13%. So there is money available which could be used to invest in infrastructure and technologies without having to put a financial burden on people. But of course, politically, this presents a challenge, because for many countries like India, helping, and Indonesia for that matter, reducing the price of energy for poor people is considered an important social priority. Economically, it has, the truth is that these subsidies do not often reach the poor, and they promote wasteful consumption. Well, it's fairly straightforward in the sense that obviously even if there were cleaner energy, there's only a certain amount of resources in the world that can be used. So if one wants to reconcile a certain degree of catch-up between the very poor and the relatively well-off, and even though economists keep arguing that it's not growth is not about a single pie that has sort of that stays fixed, and distribution is always at the expense of someone else. The pie has in the past has grown continuously, and shares of that pie have accordingly been growing as well. I think economists accept now generally that there are limits to how far the growth can continue without on a renewable basis, and so it will be rich people, not just in Western countries, but in the developing world, that will have to tighten their belts to some extent, but they're not going to do this voluntarily. So governments are going to have to find ways of using prices and markets, and to some extent penalties, to constrain consumption of among higher income people. This is this is unprecedented, and in a sense virgin territory when it comes to economic and political policy. And I mean, the only approach so far has been to change energy standards and promote through research and development alternative forms of energy. But maybe not next year, maybe not in 5 years, maybe only in 15 or 20 years. Some much more aggressive policy will have to be, sets of policies will have to be introduced to constrain the waste and the damage caused by these habits of consumption. It's easy to talk about, very hard to imagine how it will be done. Well, one hopes so. People talk about the paradox between globalization, the sharing of capital and labor and goods in the world, but our democratic systems are not yet not yet an echo of this. Democratic systems are often a victim of these broader forces. I think my own personal view is we need a world government. But this is not the only subject which a world government would manage better. Certainly we would have less poverty in the world if we had a government that was able to allocate resources and let it raise in a more equitable manner. And so instead of having foreign aid, we would have what we used to call regional development aid within boundaries of countries like Canada or Germany. But again, we're far away from any world government. We can't even, the major powers, U.S. and China, have still not signed on to the International Criminal Court. But I do think we have to try to aim through the United Nations and through some perhaps more muscular form of the G20 group at collective action, which will really have a concrete effect rather than just a moral suasion on people. Well, it's hard to know how Africa will develop, but there are countries like New Zealand that live almost entirely on agriculture. And Denmark's another example of a country that's small but very dependent on agriculture. I think agriculture should be and could remain for a long time the major focus of economic development in Africa, because they have a unique set of resources and opportunities. Africa has not just tropical climates but temperate agricultural zones as well, and instead of just exporting tropical goods like palm oil and bananas and coffee, it could produce cereals for the rest of the world. But Africa's farmers are not receiving the support or the prices that they need in order to earn a proper living, and governments have to take account of this. Until now, they've regarded agriculture as an archaic way of making a living. Africans are ready to be more productive if they're given the support and the prices and the training sometimes that they need in order to improve the way they work. Well, I think the churches, and not just the Christian churches, all religious leaders have an opportunity to promote good practices in the developing world, because research has shown consistently that the poor people, particularly people in remote areas, look to their priest, their pastor, their imam to speak up for them with government or influential people in the community, and people in developing countries have regard religion as extremely important to them. They could not conceive of separating their faith from their life, and so a strong message from churches, for example, that small farmers in Africa are crying out for support and could support themselves if they were given the right background and policies to work in, I think would be very important. And using practices, agricultural practices that are responsible with respect to impacts on the soil and water sources would also clearly be persuasive coming from religious leaders. And as some have said during this conference, setting a good example by itself, the church, the cars it chooses to use, the standard of living that the priest or the pastor or the imam leads are also important ways of expressing solidarity with those in the world who are suffering from some would say disproportionately from the consumption of others in the world. I think the voice of the church, particularly the Catholic Church, is it has no parallel, because even a former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, said that the Pope speaks for all Christians, and if that's so, he speaks for a third of humanity. If the Pope and other religious leaders came together, as someone suggested earlier today, on an inter-religious initiative like the one for peace in Assisi in the early 1980s, I think that it would set a tone and inspire many people who until now have not really taken this issue to heart. It's been really something people think about rather than something they have strong feelings or moral concerns about. And so I think the church does play a central role in developing countries, but even globally in the West, a strong position from the Christian churches would be important, and hence it's also important that the Pope in his next encyclical find a tone which which balances a sense of urgency and alarm about climate change with an attitude of practicality, that there are things already available, technologies already developed that can help us move towards a better balance between development and respect for the earth in now rather than at some distant future. I think I was struck by how new this subject was to some of us, including some of the older people in the audience. I was struck this morning by Father Keenan from Boston College saying this was the first time he'd actually written a paper on the subject of climate change and the environment. And in my case as well, even after more than 30 years of work in international development and another 6 or 7 years as a writer and a lecturer on this subject, I've only ever had a general understanding or concern about the subject. And this, I was forced in preparing my own paper to look very hard at what could be said that was useful or concrete about reconciling these two large objectives of reducing world poverty and protecting the earth. And so in that sense, it's been a personally inspiring discussion, and one which I'm intending to keep thinking about, and I hope acting on in the future. So I'm very grateful to have been invited, and also humbled by the fact that I'm not the only one who has until now thought intellectually about this rather than in my heart about the importance of change. Change in our own lives, not just government policies somewhere over there.